You can't live here. We'll take you by force if we have to." That was the first thing I heard before I'd even finished unloading my pickup. 3 SUVs blocked my gravel driveway like a military convoy, and a woman in mirrored sunglasses stood at the front, clipboard raised like a sword of authority. Her name was Karen Prescott, self-proclaimed president of the Lakeside Vista HOA, and in that moment she looked ready to declare war. I just stared at her over the bed of my truck, my hands still on a box labeled tools, wondering if she actually believed what she was saying. Apparently, she did, because she marched right up to the fence and started shouting about community bylaws, uniform paint tones, and visual harmony standards. I didn't bother pretending to understand her. The only problem with her speech was simple: my property wasn't in her HOA. Not by a foot, not by an inch, not even by a blade of grass. I'd moved here specifically to get away from HOA lunacy, and now the HOA had come to me, clipboard and all, convinced they still had control. She barked, "This area falls under our visual jurisdiction," and I almost laughed at how proud she was of the phrase, like she'd just discovered a new branch of law. I calmly replied, "Visual jurisdiction? That's new. Mind showing me where that's written?" She waved a laminated map like it was holy scripture, pointing at a section shaded faintly pink, which, according to her, extended past their official boundary line into my land. I'd already checked those coordinates months before buying the place, even filed updated records with the county, but I didn't say that yet. I let her have her performance. Behind her, 2 board members stood nodding, clutching binders thicker than a Sunday Bible. The sun glared off their SUVs, the heat shimmering off the hoods like they'd come straight from a villain convention. I told her calmly that this was county land, privately owned, legally outside HOA governance. She smirked and said, "We can still fine you for violations of community standards." I asked, "What community?" She said, "The one you're visually part of." Her logic was so unhinged I had to look away to keep a straight face. I'd lived in plenty of cities before this, worked construction for years, and seen bureaucracy at its worst, but I'd never seen anyone invent imaginary property rights based on eyesight. I told her, "Then I guess if I blink, your jurisdiction disappears." That one made the taller board member chuckle under his breath, earning a death glare from her. She scribbled something on her clipboard and declared, "We'll be issuing formal violation notices." I said, "Make sure you spell my name right. I'd hate for you to sue the wrong man." Then I turned back to unloading the truck. My dog, a quiet old retriever, lay under the oak tree watching the circus like it was his personal TV show. I'd come here for peace. After 25 years working in city development, fighting through noise, deadlines, and chaos, I wanted silence. My grandfather's land had sat untouched for decades, 5 acres of open air and oak shade overlooking a small valley where the wind actually carried the smell of grass, not exhaust. I wanted to rebuild the cabin he started before he passed, live quietly, and maybe learn how to enjoy stillness again. But HOA Karen clearly had other plans for my stillness. By the time I unloaded the last box, she was already measuring the fence with a tape, muttering to herself about symmetry violations. I leaned on the post and said, "Careful, that's trespassing." She snapped back, "It's community inspection." I pointed to the no trespassing sign that hung right beside her hand. She looked at it, scoffed, and told her board to document it. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with ordinary nosiness. This was obsession, entitlement dressed as civic duty. That evening, as the sun set behind the ridge, I sat on the porch sipping coffee and replayed the day's absurdity. It would have been funny if it weren't so intrusive. The air was golden, the crickets starting up, and yet the memory of her voice, sharp, commanding, invasive, stayed in the air like static. Most people move near an HOA and get annoyed by letters about lawn height or mailbox colors. I'd managed to move outside an HOA and still get one on my doorstep claiming dominion. There was a kind of dark humor in that. But I also knew something else. People like Karen don't stop when ignored. They escalate. They push until they find resistance, and when they don't find it, they invent new rules. I've seen that type before. The ones who confuse control with purpose. They mistake submission for cooperation. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger was a waste of energy, and I'd learned that calm precision wins every battle these types start. So while she thought I was just another naive newcomer, I was already thinking several steps ahead. My first call was to the county assessor's office, just to confirm everything again. The clerk remembered me, laughed when I mentioned the HOA trying to claim visual jurisdiction, and promised to send fresh certified copies of my property boundaries. My second step was checking the old legal folder my grandfather kept, the one with faded deeds and survey map. I'd scanned and registered them months ago, but now I took photos and stored them digitally too. Over the next few days, I noticed SUV headlights lingering at night, probably her board members taking pictures. I didn't mind. I waved once and they sped off. Karen sent a printed notice by mail that read, "Non-compliance warning, unauthorized structure, temporary residence without approval." It was addressed to resident, Lakeside Vista Zone Extension. I underlined the word extension, smiled, and pinned it to my fridge. That was her first mistake on record. What she didn't know was that I'd already registered my property under the county's unincorporated jurisdiction program, which specifically excluded HOA governance and protected private zoning rights. Every piece of documentation was airtight. So when she threatened me with collective enforcement, I knew all I had to do was keep letting her overreach. The more rope she pulled, the faster she'd hang her authority. By the fourth day, her board left another note taped to the gate. Deadline: remove unapproved fencing or face legal action. I took a picture of it, time-stamped it, and kept it in a folder labeled HOA Fantasy. I wasn't building a defense, I was building a record. There's a big difference. The funniest part came when I overheard her telling another neighbor that unsanctioned settlers degrade property value. I wanted to laugh but chose silence instead. Sometimes the most unnerving answer is none at all. She'd start learning that soon. As dusk settled that evening, I sat by the fence again, the sky orange and the air warm. My dog sighed beside me, head resting on my boot. In the distance, I could see Karen's white SUV parked at the edge of the HOA road, her headlights fixed on my cabin, as if she thought staring could shift boundaries. I looked straight at those lights until she finally turned around. I could almost hear her frustration floating in the air, that high-pitched mix of indignation and disbelief that people like her can't stand being told no. That night, as I shut the cabin door and locked it, I smiled to myself. People like Karen believed control was permanent, that authority automatically extended beyond limits just because no one challenged it. But I had already learned something she hadn't yet. Every empire of arrogance collapses the same way, quietly, under the weight of its own paperwork. I wasn't planning revenge or confrontation, not yet. I was simply preparing. My grandfather used to say, if someone builds a fence too far, don't tear it down, measure it. I intended to do exactly that. And though she didn't know it yet, Karen Prescott had just started a war she couldn't possibly win. The first official letter came 3 days later, printed on glossy paper with a golden HOA emblem at the top and the words "Notice of Violation" in bold letters across the middle. It accused me of multiple infractions, including improper gate height, unsanctioned mailbox color, and non-compliance with neighborhood aesthetic policies. The irony was the nearest house inside their HOA was half a mile away and separated by county land. I stood at my porch reading it while the wind rustled the oak leaves, amused by the theatrical tone of the letter. They even included a fine schedule and a due date. I laughed, folded it neatly, and put it in a folder marked Evidence. Over the next week more letters arrived, each more absurd than the last. One claimed my gravel driveway violated soil retention standards, another said my porch light emitted non-conforming lumens, and my favorite of all accused me of visual disharmony for owning a red pickup truck. It was like being fined by a color palette. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I started taking photos of every notice, time-stamping each one, and logging every visit from their patrol cars. They had apparently decided my land was an extension of their fantasy jurisdiction, and I decided to document their delusions step by step. The first real escalation came when I found two surveyors standing behind my barn early one morning, measuring the slope of my land with tripods. I asked what they were doing, and one mumbled something about community boundary assessment. I pointed to the no trespassing sign at the fence and said evenly, "You're 100 yards outside any community boundary." The older one looked uncomfortable and said they'd been hired by the HOA to check new proposed expansion lines. I told them they'd just violated state trespass code and that I had their vehicle's plate numbers. They packed up quickly and drove off. That same afternoon, a new letter arrived accusing me of obstruction of inspection. I took another photo. It was clear now that reason wouldn't work with them because they didn't care about rules. They cared about control. That evening I decided to speak with Sheriff Cole. He was a middle-aged man with a calm drawl and a look that said he'd seen it all before. His office was small, with a pot of stale coffee and walls lined with local fish photos. When I explained the situation, he sighed. He said, "They've been trouble for years, but technically HOAs are civil entities. They can send notices but can't enforce outside their boundary. My advice, keep records and don't engage unless it gets physical." I asked if he could confirm where the boundary ended, and he nodded, pointing at a map. "Your land's clean. They're bluffing." He leaned back and added, "They'll test you though. They always do." I thanked him and left, knowing he'd likely stay neutral until there was proof of real damage. A few days later I visited the general store to restock supplies, and that's where I met Martha. She was an older woman with sharp eyes and a voice like gravel. She ran the only store within 5 miles and knew every rumor before it became fact. The moment I walked in, she said, "You must be the fellow giving Karen a migraine." I smiled and said, "Seems she's working hard at it." Martha laughed and told me how the HOA had fined a neighbor last year for hanging a flag that wasn't on their approved color list. She said Karen built her little empire by bullying the quiet ones and flattering the powerful. I told her I had no intention of being either. She winked and said, "Good, then you'll last longer than most." Back home I started noticing more drive-bys from white SUVs with HOA stickers. They'd stop at the end of the road, take photos, then leave. I began filming them with my phone each time, keeping silent but letting them know I was watching. The next step came when Karen herself showed up again with a clipboard, flanked by 2 board members. She said, "We've scheduled a mandatory inspection for all perimeter properties, including yours." I replied, "I'm not in your perimeter." She smiled tightly. "That's up for review." I said, "Not by you." She ignored me and began pointing at my fence. "This height violates HOA Standard 6.2 on uniform sidelines." I said, "You have no jurisdiction here." She snapped, "You can't just make up your own rules." I answered, "That's exactly what you're doing." One of her board members started to speak, but she cut him off and declared, "We'll resolve this formally." I said, "Please do. I love paperwork." Then I turned my back and went inside. Through the window I saw her pacing and gesturing wildly before leaving. A day later another envelope appeared in my mailbox labeled Notice of Pending Action. It stated that the HOA had voted to include my property in their jurisdiction under a visual annexation clause. I nearly choked on my coffee laughing at that one. They had actually written those words in an official document. That was when I decided to bring another ally into the picture. My neighbor Jake lived inside the HOA and worked as a landscaper. We'd spoken briefly before and I knew he wasn't a fan of their control either. When I mentioned the annexation letter, he shook his head and said, "She's out of her mind. She's been talking about expanding the community boundary for months, says it'll raise property values." I asked if he could keep an ear open during their meetings. He agreed, saying, People are scared of her. Maybe if she pushes too far, they'll turn. Over the next week, I continued receiving bogus fines and warnings. One notice accused me of noise pollution because I was running a generator during daylight hours. Another said my dog wasn't registered with the community. I didn't even bother responding. Each letter went into the growing evidence folder. Then came the strangest part. They started parking SUVs near my driveway pretending to do roadside maintenance. It was intimidation disguised as duty. I let them, never giving them the reaction they wanted. The quieter I stayed, the louder their antics became. Sheriff Cole stopped by one evening, leaning against his cruiser with that same calm look. He said, "They've been calling our office daily, trying to file complaints. We can't act because it's outside their boundary. Just don't give them an inch." I thanked him again, and he nodded toward the horizon. She won't quit. She likes an audience. As if on cue, Karen's SUV rolled slowly past the road, her window down, sunglasses glinting. Cole muttered, "There goes the mayor of nowhere." I spent that night setting up motion lights and a trail camera near the fence, just in case they tried another inspection stunt. The air was thick and silent except for the insects and the distant hum of the highway. I thought about my grandfather again, how he used to say, "People who live behind fences always forget there's a world beyond them." Maybe that was the problem with Karen. Her sense of authority ended at the HOA line, but her ego didn't. A few days later I attended a community meeting inside the HOA just to see their operation firsthand. The room smelled like new carpet and coffee, walls lined with motivational posters about pride and progress. Karen stood at the podium wearing a red blazer and an expression of total control. She recognized me immediately and her tone changed. "Mr. Dalton, thank you for joining us," she said sweetly. "We were just discussing future community expansion." I asked, "Including other people's land?" Murmurs filled the room. She waved a hand and said, "We prefer the term integration." I replied, "That's what conquerors say." Her smile tightened. "You misunderstand. We're protecting the visual identity of the neighborhood." I asked, "Whose vision?" She didn't answer directly, only said, "The majority's." I could feel the tension from a few residents who clearly disagreed but stayed silent. I let her speech drag on before leaving quietly. Outside, one of the younger members whispered, "She's pushing too far." That was all I needed to hear. The cracks were forming. By the time I got home that night, another SUV had been parked across the road, engine idling. I approached slowly, phone recording. The driver sped off without a word. I watched the taillights disappear down the hill and felt that familiar mix of irritation and curiosity. These people thought intimidation would work on someone who'd seen actual construction sites, standoffs, and bureaucratic wars far uglier than this. They were amateurs playing empire. Still, I knew this wouldn't stop on its own. It would take evidence, patience, and timing. So I walked back to the porch, set my camera to record the gate, and wrote down everything that had happened so far. They wanted to play law, I thought. Fine. I'd show them how it's really done. By the next week, the whole town was talking about the feud, even though I hadn't said a word publicly. Rumors moved faster than wind through dry grass, and somehow everyone knew that the HOA president was trying to seize land that wasn't hers. Every time I stopped by the general store, Martha would fill me in on the latest version of the story, her voice full of amusement as she stocked shelves. According to her, Karen had been telling everyone at church and the farmers' market that I was illegally expanding into community property and refusing to cooperate with local governance. Some folks believed her, some didn't. The gossip spread like wildfire, splitting opinions down the middle. Half the people admired my silence, saying it was smart not to stoop to her level. The other half assumed silence meant guilt. I didn't care much either way. I knew truth had a strange way of revealing itself when arrogance got too loud. I just made sure my cameras kept rolling, my paperwork stayed organized, and my temper never rose higher than a whisper. Jake stopped by one morning, parking his beat-up truck beside my gate. He looked uneasy as he stepped out, glancing over his shoulder as if he didn't want to be seen. He told me that during the last HOA meeting Karen had unveiled a brand new proposal called the Extended Boundary Initiative. She claimed it would unify the area and prevent unsightly developments, which apparently meant my house and red truck. He handed me a folded paper. It was a copy of the proposal he'd swiped from their files. On it was a hand-drawn map extending the HOA line straight through my land and labeling it as Pending Community Integration Zone. The boldness of it was so absurd it almost impressed me. I thanked him and asked why he was risking his position. He said quietly, "Because she's gone too far. People are scared to speak up, but this isn't right." That small act of courage meant more to me than he probably realized. It confirmed that not everyone inside her ranks believed her delusions. Later that afternoon I drove into the county office to verify everything. The clerk, a thin man with glasses, recognized my name immediately. When I handed him the HOA document, he raised an eyebrow and laughed. "This isn't filed anywhere. It's not legal." He typed on his computer, looked at the county registry map, and printed an official statement confirming the HOA's jurisdiction stopped exactly at the creek that marked the eastern border of my property. "They can't just draw new lines with crayons," he said, shaking his head. I thanked him and asked if he could notarize the document. He did, stamping it with a satisfying thump of ink. That single sheet of paper was worth more than all their threats combined. When I returned home, I found another envelope taped to my gate. This one said Final Notice, Unpaid Dues and Violations. They had included a bill for $1,200 in accumulated fines. I took a photo and laughed. It was a perfect addition to my evidence folder. That night I uploaded every document, photo, and video to a cloud drive, labeling everything clearly. I knew how these stories went. People like Karen never stopped until they embarrassed themselves publicly, and when that day came I wanted every second of it preserved. A few days later I was in Martha's store again when she told me something that made my stomach twist and then relax with dark amusement. Karen was planning a large community event, a welcome gathering, and she'd scheduled it to take place on the open field right at the edge of my property. She'd even ordered banners and invited local press to cover the expansion celebration. Martha leaned closer and said, "She's saying the land's already under HOA maintenance. You going to stop her?" I said, "No. I'm going to let her dig her own hole." That night I walked the property line, checking every corner marker and boundary flag. The moonlight glowed on the new survey stakes I'd put in myself, all GPS verified. The air was quiet except for the hum of cicadas. I realized that Karen's arrogance wasn't just irritating, it was a gift. Every move she made built a trail of evidence that would make her downfall undeniable. People like her were so blinded by control they didn't realize how visible they'd become. I stood at the field where she planned her event and pictured it. The tents, the cameras, the crowd applauding as she claimed land that wasn't hers. It would all be recorded, and once she crossed the line physically and publicly, there would be no retreat. The next morning Jake called me, his voice tense. "She's serious about this event," he said. "She's got food trucks lined up, vendors, even local news. She's calling it the HOA Unification Day." I asked him to do one thing, make sure someone from the board mentioned the event in their official minute. He agreed. That record would make it indisputable later that the HOA planned to enter my land knowingly. While she was busy planning her show, I quietly filed a formal notice of trespass with the county clerk. It stated that any individual or organization entering my property without written consent would be subject to immediate legal complaint and damages under state law. I didn't send it to her directly. I wanted her to find out the hard way. Then I called the environmental department about potential unauthorized land disturbance since they were preparing to set up food stalls and generators on soil that bordered the creek. The officer I spoke with said he'd note the concern and might send someone to inspect if reports came in. I smiled. I didn't need to stop her plans. I just needed her to finish them. A few days before the event, I saw trucks dropping off portable toilets and equipment near the road. HOA volunteers were hammering in signs reading Community Celebration Area. I stayed out of sight and kept filming from the porch. It was like watching someone decorate their own crime scene. Every hammer strike, every banner fluttering in the breeze was one more piece of proof that they were trespassing on property they didn't own. The morning before the big day, Martha called to tell me the town was buzzing. "She's telling everyone it's finally happening," she said. "Half the folks think she's brave. The other half think she's insane. I'm bringing popcorn either way." I thanked her and told her to stay close to the news. That night, as the sun went down, I could see the lights of the setup crew working in the distance. The noise of generators echoed faintly through the trees. My dog perked his ears but stayed calm, sensing my composure. I sat on the porch writing in my notebook, noting times, sounds, and details. The sky turned purple, and the first crickets began their song. I couldn't help but appreciate the absurd poetry of the situation, a self-proclaimed ruler building a stage for her own humiliation. The next morning, before dawn, I took one last walk around the property. I checked the cameras, repositioned one near the road, and made sure the boundary markers were visible. The air was crisp, the kind that smells like wood and dew, and for a moment I felt that deep quiet that first drew me here. I thought about my grandfather and how proud he would have been of how I handled it. No shouting, no chaos, just careful patience and evidence stacked higher than their arrogance. Later that afternoon Jake texted me that the HOA board had finalized a resolution declaring my land conditionally accepted pending review. Those words sealed their fate because they admitted in writing they didn't have jurisdiction yet. They were claiming authority before possessing it, a fatal administrative mistake. I didn't respond, just smiled. As the sun dipped low, the valley turned orange and gold, and I could hear distant music from the event setup. It was surreal. I stood there watching the crowd gather on my land, oblivious that each step they took deeper into the field was another legal nail in Karen's coffin. Some neighbors waved uncertainly, not realizing what they were part of. I waved back politely, keeping my calm expression while inside I was already building the plan for what came next. They thought my silence meant defeat, but silence is just strategy when you know the ending before the story's halfway told. When I went back inside that night, I reviewed the footage one more time. The cameras had caught everything: the signs, the equipment, the cars parked past the boundary. I labeled the folder day before the fall. By morning, the trap would be fully set, and Karen wouldn't even know she had built it herself.